Have you ever found yourself obsessing over somebody and unable to think about anything else? The experience is so intense and overwhelming. Well, this experience might not be love. It could be that what you're feeling is limerence. So let's dive into how limerence affects the mind. Limerence is an obsessive involuntary attachment to somebody, to the limerent object. It's a fantasy-like state that's very similar to addiction. It's actually categorized as a compulsive obsession. Limerence begets intrusive thoughts, a tremendous amount of ruminating and idealization, which means you're putting this person on a pedestal, which is a reality that they couldn't live up to. If you have a limerent object, it doesn't mean you actually know this person in the flesh, because a lot of people are in limerence or obsessed with maybe a famous person, somebody they've never met. But either way, limerence is a way to, first of all, avoid real intimacy in the everyday life. And limerence also reminds me of a scene that I saw on Saturday Night Live once.
What an agoraphobic claustrophobic is doing.
This looping cycle is reminiscent of limerence. And I say that because the reason one might be experiencing limerence is that subconsciously there's a cognitive dissonance happening. So simultaneously, the person experiencing limerence will be both completely petrified and scared to experience intimate, vulnerable relationships, while also wanting and desiring with the greatest urge to have an intimate relationship. And because of this, there's a cognitive dissonance. So there's a swing. We can't be in one or the other because we want both. I am somebody who's experienced a lot of limerence in my life, and I understand how completely painful and debilitating it can be. I experienced so much rumination that it would absolutely steal from my everyday experiences. It was a very difficult thing. And I perceive that people that experience limerence had a propensity as a child to daydream to an extensive amount. Now, limerence is going to be categorized as a compulsive disorder, or because they had childhood emotional neglect and abandonment. Now, of course, the way we process our emotional trauma is from our perspective, so it's all relative. But they will have internalized and perceived that they went through a significant amount of emotional neglect and emotional abandonment. And this will also include self-abandonment. When we're in a limerent type fantasy state, as a child, it can be a safe place to just go into la la land, to fantasize. It's a wonderful way to dismiss yourself from your everyday reality that is just too painful to face. Now, when we're experiencing limerence as an adult, there's a temporary infatuation, and it's driven by the need for validation and security. You'll have unrealistic expectations that you're imposing onto this person through your fantasies, and it's fueled by a need for these validations and self-fulfillments. This obsession can result in neglect of other important aspects in your life. And you'll be consumed quite possibly by thoughts and emotions in your behaviors. The reason that the person in your limerent fantasy is referred to as a limerent object is because you're treating it, even just in your mind, that you possess them, that they are your possession. This dehumanizes them. And while you're idealizing them, you're also devaluing them as an individual who's allowed their own autonomy and boundaries. It's a form of dissociation, and it comes from a need to feel safe in the fantasy because the reality of possibly trying to be vulnerable and experience this intimately is just too scary to approach. Now, the solution that I found was to understand first and foremost that if I'm experiencing limerence, or when I have in the past, it's because the person I'm focused on met some need that I deeply yearn for. It's a need that was only partially met in my childhood. Now, it'll be most likely that they only partially meet the need as well in your real life or how you've perceived it. And this could be a need to feel seen or understood, a need to experience attention or intimacy, what have you. But it'll be important for you to focus in and isolate, become aware of what need they met for you. And then at the same time, it'll be important for you to notice what are your unmet needs. You're only ever doing anything as a strategy to meet your needs. So if you're meeting your needs through a limerent fantasy, what needs are you meeting? Which means what needs are unmet in your everyday life. Now, once you've placed these unmet needs and the partially met needs, it'll be implicitly important for you to understand that this individual is simply a placeholder for the caretakers in your childhood that you first experienced the neglect and the emotional abandonment with. You will have overlaid the limerent object, the person in your fantasy and now, onto the emotional wounds of what happened in your childhood. So when these experiences and thoughts come up, it'll be very imperative for you to understand that you're playing out a theater in your mind. You've got players and characters. You're in the scene and the limerent object is in the scene. But this is all a fast forward for something that actually happened in your childhood. So who are they acting as a placeholder for? It's very possible that if you're heterosexual, it would have been your opposite sex parent. Or if you're a homosexual, it would have been your same-sex parent, what have you. It's your personal experience. You're the only one that's going to know where it fits. Though you need to recognize very clearly that the limerent object is simply a placeholder for the origin point of the trauma. And every time you go into that limerent fantasy and start focusing on the individual, it's your responsibility to direct your inner child back to the caretaker that didn't meet your needs. So you can see what it is that you're yearning for and you're needing. And you can start to draw yourself out of that fantasy state, meet your own needs, and come back into reality. Now, the great thing about limerence is that it's usually just temporary and it will calm itself down. Though anybody who's in an experience that's uncomfortable knows that time seems to slow down. It can feel excruciating and debilitating. So it's very important that you get focused on looking at what are your unmet needs, what are your partially met needs, and who is the actual origin caretaker of the trauma itself.